Good morning. I gotta say, Singapore's Cyber Week beats Camden, New Jersey's Cyber Week. So thank you for having me here. Excited to be here. I'm gonna speak at New Jersey auctioneer speed to try to cram in as much information as I can in the next 27 minutes. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is kind of the conclusions we have from responding to over 500 breaches in the last 12 months. Just the lessons we've learned from the front lines. And basically, the next speaker, Mr. Singh, has said, you need 3 stories in 1 point. But in the United States Air Force, I learned you need 3 points, and I don't even have a story. But my 3 points today will be, I'm going to talk about the conclusions that we learned during all these breaches, what are folks doing about it, and then I'll end with a little discussion what I anticipate in the future. But like I said, over the last 12 months, we had 500 plus investigations. I think in 2017, we're going to have about 600 to 650 different investigations into cybersecurity breaches. And a lot of folks will think this is a very tactical thing. You respond to breaches, you figure out what happened, and then you just get out of town. The reality is every time we respond to a breach, we figure out what happened, but we also have to answer the question, what to do about it. And I would say we learn a lot about what it takes to red team a network on offense to break in and how folks are doing that, and then what it takes to blue team a network or to defend the network appropriately. We've responded in 17 different countries, and this is based on where the countries are headquartered. Primarily, the majority of the cases were originated in the Western Hemisphere, but the hotbed of activity that we've seen the most growth in is responding to breaches that originated and impacted the Middle East. So again, conclusions, what do we do about it in 5 years out? One of the statistics we've been tracking since 1998 as we respond to breaches is what's the trigger mechanism to know you've got a problem. And back in 1998, I would have said 100% of the breaches we responded to were not self-detected. That in fact, the organizations were learning out about a breach from a third party. But that was primarily a different time. And now we've seen, I would argue, an improvement in our detection rates. And folks are now detecting when they have their own incident. I'd like to say there's a bias to that number because nobody hires FireEye to respond to breaches when their staff is only 5 minutes behind the breach. We usually get hired when the breaches are at a scale and scope or complexity where somebody needs outside help, and then we'll show up and triage the incident appropriately. But 53% internal discovery is the best we've seen throughout my career. And here's another statistic, and we call this dwell time, but from the moment an attacker breaks in or has unfettered access to the network to the moment a victim company understands that they've in fact had a circumvention of their security posture has gone down to 99 days for the breaches that we have responded to and have first-hand knowledge of. That's a lot better than 2011, and you're seeing marked improvement, and we'll talk to some of the reasons why. One of the conclusions that's held steady throughout my entire career, well, I would say since at least about 2003, are that attacks continue because there's no risk or repercussions to the attacks. There are safe harbors out there, and we try to be in all the hot zones. I'm not anti-China, I'm not anti-Russia, I'm not anti-Iran. We just go where the breaches are. And right now, there just seems to be pretty good alignment between countries sanctioned by the United States and countries hacking a whole bunch of other places. The safe harbors that I've witnessed throughout my career, Iran's a safe harbor for offensive operations, so is Russia, so is China, and so is North Korea. So those are the ones we've seen, but that being said, they're safe harbors for criminal activity, and then I would argue almost every modern nation is a safe harbor for what's considered fair game for cyber espionage on the internet. But we don't have any risks or repercussions. Without risks or repercussions, what's the deterrent? If you're in a nation that will allow certain criminal activities on the internet, it's hard to have proportional response to those types of activities. You heard a lot of speakers speak yesterday about the need for international rules of engagement. I think that'll go a long way to help in that situation. Second thing that I've learned is attackers continue to exploit human trust, and it's a little bit different in different regions, but when we look at what is victim zero, meaning the first victim in a breach, over 90% of the breaches that we get hired to respond to, victim zero was a spear phishing attack. And what's behind that spear phishing attack could be a malicious link, could be a malicious document, usually it's an Office document or a PDF document but a lot of times it's just a link to a standard executable trying to circumvent your common safeguards like antivirus. When we take it outside of the United States and look at about 50 breaches that we responded to in other geographies, it's not 90% spear phishing. It's approximately 45% vulnerable systems on the internet being compromised, and then about 45% spear phishing to break in. And then you may be asking, well, wait a minute, that doesn't add to 100%. We don't always find victim zero 100% of the time. There are times where we respond to breaches. We've confirmed there's been a breach, but we're wholly unaware of how the intrusion occurred. Either the evidence doesn't exist anymore, or the evidence doesn't exist where we get to look for it. Meaning it could be an exploit of one of your workers at home, and their user ID and passphrase just happen to be the access that the attacker uses to break in. So the attackers are exploiting human trust, and it's been my observation over the last 15 years that attack vectors have changed. There was a time in the 90s and 2000s, and I would argue this is more synonymous to criminal hacking behavior, meaning hacking for profit. The attacks used to attack vulnerable systems. One of the biggest changes over the last 15 years is attacks went from targeting systems where people would just scan the internet for vulnerable services, banner grab a vulnerable service, figure out what it is, find a publicly available exploit, and exploit it. Now people are targeting humans on the other end. The whole goal is to dupe or trick a human into doing something where they unwittingly compromise their machine. And if it's spear phishing, and you get great at blocking every malicious email, and yet I've always found one does get through, there's any communication that you have to the outside world from an organization can allow somebody the opportunity on the faceless internet to dupe a user into doing the wrong thing. The attacks that we respond to tend to reflect geopolitical conditions. I've been responding to breaches since 1993, and for some reason I did not figure this out till 2013. So I probably should have saw this a little sooner. But when I was responding to breaches in the military in the 90s, the majority of the breaches that were hitting the United States military did come from Russia and China, and the breaches were what I call .gov against .gov, .mil against .mil, and it all felt like a fair fight, and that was normal. But things started to change. I think that there's been an interesting challenge for a lot of advanced nations as they use cyber as a tactic or strategy in cyberspace. No one's anchored their rules of engagement. Nobody's quite sure what their nation wants to do on offense. Almost everywhere I travel, I get to meet with sometimes the heads of the intelligence community or the heads of the defense community in different nations, and it's very rare where we don't have a discussion about offense and how to develop that capability and how that ability could be used. So I think you're going to see more and more nations getting into this, but it is definitely tied to geopolitical conditions. And I'll just talk about 4 nations in regards to this slide. First, we'll take China. When you look at what China's been doing since, in my career, at least since 2004, I've observed what I would attribute to Chinese military units were hacking military or government, and it all felt normal. But in about 2004, strategy may have changed, and we saw more Chinese military breaching the private sector of the West, whether it be Germany, India, Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom. I would say the countries on the list dwarf the countries that are actually off that list. And that behavior continued to rise from 2004 to about 2015 with some dips. But in 2015, we definitely saw a change in the cyber activities coming out of China in regards to hacking the private sector. It appears that they've reduced their target area of what they're going after. I'm still not certain what's considered fair game for espionage, but I do know that the attacks that we used to see coming out of China into the US alone would hit about 80 different companies a month on average for years at a time. And then, and by the way, we only knew at FireEye the lowest bounds of that number, but that number dipped in August of 2015, 1 month before the head of state of China met with the head of state of the United States to talk about a cyber treaty. And that number went almost overnight from over 80 companies and organizations breached a month down to 4. And I think it's hovered in the single digits ever since. And I don't think this is a whole huge evasion. FireEye just doesn't see the cyber espionage activity. I actually think it got dialed back based on geopolitical conditions and an understanding of some new rules of engagement. Russia dialed it up in 2016, and I would say Russia dialed it up really in the United States in 2014. Throughout most of my military career, I was on the front lines doing forensics on machines that were compromised by folks that I would attribute were in Russia and most likely state actors. And one of the things that I noticed in the 90s and early 2000s is whenever we responded to a breach from the Russian government, they never really let us observe what they did. So if we respond to a breach, you can tell we're doing it. Sometimes there's countermeasures being taken, but a lot of times you have to deploy specialized software just to do the investigation. At that time, my company was called Mandia, and we were responding to dozens and dozens of breaches from the Russian government. And then we ended up naming our forensic software Mandia Intelligent Response, or MIR. And it was never lost on us that mir means peace in Russian. And we would deploy mir.exe to all the machines and respond. And it was our way of kind of acknowledging who we were up against in cyberspace, at least in the United States. And I think the United States is a hot zone to see what Russia's capability is, but so is Ukraine, Estonia, and other nations in Eastern Europe. But every time we deployed mir.exe, the offensive activity would cease. But that stopped in August of 2014. And it just so happens that August of 2014 was the same month that there were little green men spotted in the Ukraine, and the United States started doing sanctions against Russia. The same month, we started responding to breaches in the United States universities by the same groups that we would attribute to the Russian government, and they were targeting the email of professors who had published anti-Putin documents. And I'd seen other nations follow that tact, but quite frankly, throughout my career, every time the Russians broke in, it was about theft of intellectual property for security reasons. Really, it was against our military, and that made sense for espionage. Here they were hacking universities, not a very fair fight, but one where they wanted to learn the doctrine being spoken by anti-Putin folks. Third thing they did, same month, August of 2014, never saw this happen, is their counter-forensics got different. So they didn't go away when we were responding to a breach. We were able to observe them, and counter-forensics is largely a manual discipline by the attacker after they hack in. And there's a lot of different examples. You can clear log files, edit log files. You can clear the information that you've stolen. And most operators on offense, if you're going to steal a bunch of documents from a victim network, you create a staging directory. You stage all those documents in that directory, you compress and encrypt those documents, and then you take them out any protocol that works. And you may have to take it out in a lot of different pieces. And then, as an operator that's thinking counter-forensics, you remove that directory, because then the investigators can't see what files you took. And they stopped doing that in a lot of cases. And I thought there's a lot of theories. I'm not a mind reader, but my conclusion was, all in August of 2014, the doctrine, whether it's written or unwritten, from Russia on offense was rewritten. It was changed. They were more aggressive. They let us observe them. They stopped their counter-forensics. They broadened their targeting. And then in 2016, we can link them to intrusions where the documents that were taken during those intrusions appeared on WikiLeaks, DC Leaks, and other sites that were started by anonymous people somewhere in the world. So that's a new one, and it kind of goes to the asymmetry of the internet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Third state, if I had to summarize 2017 to date, I would say it's the growth of Iran's cyber activities. And yes, the majority of the intrusions we respond to, we do attribute to nation-state actors. So it's either a nation that's condoning the activity but aware of it, or it's actually folks in uniform or paid by a sovereign nation to do the intrusions. And Iran's really grown quite a bit. The first time in my career I personally experienced a breach attributed to Iran was in 2008. I thought that the trace evidence left behind led me to conclude that the attackers just got out of a classroom. They were trying out things. They didn't always run their tools right. They had the tendency to run custom malware correctly, meaning they got trained on the custom stuff. But when they ran publicly available tools, they'd run it incorrectly, meaning they were expected to figure out the stuff you could download from the internet and nobody trained them on it. They've gotten a lot better. And in 2016, and especially in 2017, the amount of times we're responding to intrusions where we had attributed to state actors in Iran or somebody in Iran who's it's condoned is quite high. And I would argue right now we're responding to several dozen breaches. It wouldn't surprise me if over half of them we'd attribute to Iran. One of the interesting things about them is as we respond to every breach, we catalog the evidence, and we take that trace evidence and we compare it to about 16 years of history, and we've always cataloged the evidence with a lot of rigor and discipline. And a lot of times as we respond to breaches and we keep cataloging all this trace evidence and we compare it to history, we know who it is. That just enough operational security dips occurred where we can pierce anonymity and figure out who it is. And as we've done this, we have one group out of Iran where we're responding to them in the Middle East, and the rules of engagement are very destructive. As soon as they break into, let's say, systems in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they delete everything immediately. And it's pretty interesting to observe. That same group, if they breach an organization in the United States, they follow a different targeting, and they don't delete information. They steal primarily the emails of American reporters. Same group, same tactics, techniques, and procedures, minus the scorched earth philosophy of let's just destroy everything. So it's interesting to see that they have rules of engagement in Iran based on geography, hence geopolitical conditions. North Korea, probably the last one I'll mention. Hard for me to pinpoint and categorize them because as we collect trace evidence, hard to see the patterns because I've seen them hack for destruction, and that looked one way. And then I've seen them hack for money, and that looked a different way. And we're not getting the same level of empirical data on their activities that we do get from Chinese cyber espionage campaigns, Russian government activities, Russian criminal activities, or Iran. But they're out there doing it, and obviously it's a safe harbor. The good news, there's only about 7 IP addresses from North Korea. I doubt there's any rogue hackers there. If you see that IP address range pop up, you know who it is. There is no balance of power on the internet. And I made this slide after I was reading a Kissinger book, and I just felt like I had to go through this. But here's what I mean by that. That there's a bunch of nations that their economy and their jobs that they have rely on the internet, period. And they rely on e-commerce. And they're sort of in a glass house because if we actually retaliated in cyberspace to a lot of the breaches that come out of Russia, we could probably only lose. If the only domain all the activity is in cyber, Russia wins. Or North Korea clearly has seen that there's asymmetry. They are creating nuclear weapons, they do have warheads, but they've also recognized, and they have doctrine where they've recognized very few cybersecurity exploit developers can do a lot of asymmetric damage to modern nations that rely on infrastructure. A further balance of power, and I've always said the analogy, especially in the United States is in a glass house in cyber, and if we respond in cyberspace to North Korea, I'm pretty sure they don't have the same economic risk in cyberspace that the United States does. But another asymmetry, and it applies, and it's sort of east versus west, this idea of information warfare seems to be asymmetric against nations that have freedom of the press. And what I mean by that is if you see an executive or a diplomat or a wealthy or influential individual compromised, and then their email appears on WikiLeaks or DC Leaks or some other site anonymously, the Western press will pick it up and it ruins careers, affects lives. And there is no tit for tat against many nations in that sort of warfare. For example, when the chief of staff of Hillary Clinton's election was compromised and John Podesta's email was leaked, the Western press covers it. And the tit for tat would be, well, let's just hack Putin's email and publish it. But I doubt that the press reaction in Russia would be the same. So there's asymmetry in the information impact. There's asymmetry that we're all playing defense in cyberspace, and it's a heck of a lot more fun and a lot easier to be on the offense. It's hard to pitch a perfect game every day if you're a security professional. We've seen extortion rise tremendously in cyber, and the reason why is, quite frankly, it comes down to an anonymous currency known as whatever you want to call it. Bitcoin's the most popular anonymous currency. If you can hack somebody and get something valuable, and you're in a nation that allows that sort of activity for whatever reason, you can make a lot of money. And we're seeing this rise dramatically. And it kind of happened at the same time. There used to be a whole apparatus, primarily from Eastern Europe and Russia, that would hack for monetary gain. But their goal is to steal ATM card numbers and try to withdraw cash, or get credit card numbers and try to fraudulently buy something and then launder it. But with attacks that happened against the major retailers in the United States, where they lost millions and millions of credit card numbers, we added additional defenses to the payment card industry's data security. And as we do that, and the retailers get more secure, and banks are secure, or as secure as reasonable, and you get this added security, but at the same time frame, the adoption of an anonymous currency. It's a perfect storm to be able to hack and make money. And the extortions that we've been responding to are now into the American dollar equivalent of multiple millions of dollars. So it's real, it's frustrating, and I'm probably within the last 3 weeks, I've been on the phone call C-level execs to deal with these issues. There's a lot of major organizations that get Bitcoin ahead of time just in case, because another thing is the crypto lockers that are out there. If you notice the crypto lockers, if they get in, they're indiscriminate attacks. It should tell you something about your security posture, whereas the extortions are a little bit more targeted. And if crypto locker occurs, they can accept credit card numbers, but you actually get the discount if you pay with Bitcoin. Seriously. So they've recognized, meaning the criminals have recognized, the anonymity that Bitcoin provides is a good thing for them. And so it's good to have a little bit of Bitcoin laying around. If you're a hospital and somebody hacks you and they've made some systems unusable, we've seen people pay the Bitcoin to get drives decrypted. Doesn't always work. If you hacked and you know it, in many nations, it's probable third parties know it. And that's a frustration, and I can tell you the attackers know it, and depending on who you are, the attackers are going to the blogosphere and telling the blogists of the world, hey, I've compromised such and such an organization. A lot of intrusions now, I think, are driven by a difference of ideology, and because of the no risk or repercussions to the hackers, it can really empower some youth or some folks that are ideologically different than many organizations' mentalities. They'll break in, they'll extort you, but they just recognize it's too much fun to create harm, and they'll go live. They'll tell a blogist, they'll tell somebody, and everybody's a publisher in today's internet age. Fake news. But it's more likely than not, most companies we respond to, the breach goes public in a manner that can't be controlled. And it's very frustrating. A lot of times companies find out they've had a breach of significance the same day the public or the world finds out about it. And that's a dangerous thing to have to disclose when you're under what I call the fog of war. For any of you that have responded to breaches, one of the most common misperceptions is you can solve what happened in 5 minutes. That doesn't exist in most cases. When we respond to breaches to figure out what happened, sometimes it takes multiple days just to collect the data to figure out what happened. And here's the reality. I've done a lot of investigations. If you find nothing, the investigations last pretty long. And if you find a whole ton of evidence about activities being taken, the investigation also lasts pretty long. And pretty long could be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, can be 5 days. It all depends what the attacker took, how well the audit trail is, and whether the attacker erased the audit trail. But this is a frustration that we have to live with as security professionals. If you hacked and you know it, make the assumption that somebody else does too, and you're in a foot race to figure out what happened and what you're going to do about it. so that you can withstand any third-party scrutiny that might occur if that intrusion goes public. I think attribution matters to these breaches so we can hold nations accountable. You heard all three of the first speakers of the conference yesterday, from the Deputy Prime Minister to Rob Joyce of the White House to the man from Indonesia, how important it is to hold nations accountable so we can figure out some international rules of engagement. If you can hack without risk or repercussions and do criminal activity wantonly, it's just going to continue to happen. This week we'll read about one major breach. Next week we'll read about the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And the only way to really put an end to that is have some risks behind it. So what do we do about it? I just made a quick list of the things that are working. When we respond to breaches, we have the privilege of having a front row seat to an organization, have the mentality and mindset, we are going to change our security posture from point A to point B now. And we're going to up it a notch if possible. And these are just the things that work. I'm going to point out a few. I believe this: when you're in the military, you train with, there's no better training than live fire. There's no better training than drills. I love the concept of red teaming your networks in a witting, known way so you can see if the threats you don't want to have become a reality can happen. Red teaming's an incredible cost-efficient way to figure out how good are your defenses. Can you detect them? Can you prevent the attacks? Can what you're most worried about become a reality from a hotel room like the Conrad and a couple smart folks trying to break in and do it? And if you do it in a witting way, it's a coachable, teachable moment. And you can show people, we've got to do better at detecting this. We've got to fine-tune these instruments and tools that we've bought from 78 different vendors. So I love that. I call it a dry run of an incident response plan, but in reality, red team your network. And I don't mean pen test. Everybody can break into a network somewhere. Vulnerability scans, you get a free one every day on the internet. So trust me, you're vulnerable somewhere. And then it's just that dry run's really helpful. I have a bullet for use new technology to block advanced malware. I'm really speaking to getting away from signature-based technologies on the endpoint and getting to a technology that detects what AV misses. We all do network security monitoring relatively well. That's the first defense measure most people put in. And then we're so reliant on antivirus. The problem is it's just been missing too much for the last 15 to 20 years that we got to get a new technology there. Last thing I'd mention here is, as everybody goes to mobile and everybody accesses your network as well as their private LinkedIn and their private eBay accounts and everything else from mobile platforms or from work machines, I would highly recommend you make the access to all corporate resources two-factor authentication. That probably has the most positive impact against attackers who are trying to increase their access to your network. 5 years out, so where's it going to end? First and foremost, any conflict that Singapore has, although you remind me of, you're like the Switzerland of Asia, but if there is a conflict here or you're involved in a side in a conflict, there's absolutely going to be a cyber component to it. And what's interesting is some industry is probably expected by its citizens to be good enough to withstand military-based cyber attacks. And I'll give you one: the utilities. If you run the electric grids and you provide energy to everything, probably expected, even if you're a private sector, although Singapore, you have an interesting balance between government and private sector. I haven't sorted it out just yet, I'm trying to figure it out. But in the United States, I think utilities, and actually in most modern nations, they're expected to have a defense that can withstand a cyber military attack. Because if you lose electricity in cyberspace, you lose everything else. All the other critical infrastructure is going to go. You're going to lose healthcare, you're going to lose financials, and so I think that's target number one for any modern war between two nations with a cyber capability. That's a bummer of a news. I do end on a high note. I think you got to have international rules of engagement. I think if you go out 5 years from now, what you're really going to see is a lot of nations that have conditional anonymity in cyberspace, meaning if you're using the internet for something wrong, a modern nation can go through courts and due process to figure out who's doing that wrong action and then take action. And there'll be nations that can impose risk to folks that are bad actors on the internet. There'll be nations that decide not to impose risk. Over time, you'll see a different experience on the internet from nations that do not impose risk on criminal acts. It's just going to happen over time. It's already happening. So we'll see that happen. And then what will benefit from this? You're going to see nations that uphold rules of engagement for state-level actors to abide by, and state-level capability to abide by, and knowing that if laws are broken, that you can see international cooperation to figure it out. We're going to have to sort out privacy. Privacy is a cultural issue. It's tough to be an international organization and create one product that's going to fit the cultural needs of a global economy. So that'll be a big issue as well. And I'll just leave you with the final slide. I think it was the gentleman from the White House yesterday, and I'll quote him wrong, but it'll take everybody in this room. The challenge that we have and the reason we're here today is we all recognize the promise and power of the internet. The fact that my watch 5 years from now will know if I'm having a medical condition before I do, probably tell my doctor that I'm having that medical condition, and help will be on its way before I collapse and crawl out of my office from the inevitable heart attack I intend to have in 5 years or less. So that's an incredible capability, but you got to trust it. And that's what we'll all be challenged with doing throughout the rest of our careers. Thank you very much for your time.